Before this world had a name, before matter existed, before time began counting, something inside the highest realm of light broke apart in a single, silent moment. And everything you have ever suffered, every war ever fought, every soul that has ever felt trapped in this reality, all of it traces back to that one fracture inside the Pleroma. There's a story older than every religion on this planet, older than the first temple ever built, older than the first name ever spoken into the dark. It is not a myth written to comfort the fearful or a legend invented to explain the unknown. It is a record, hidden, buried, and nearly destroyed, of something that actually happened before this world came into existence. And once you hear it in full, the way you see yourself, the way you see this reality, and the way you understand your own suffering will never be the same again. Most people move through their entire lives asking the wrong question. They ask, why is the world broken? They ask why good people suffer. They ask why evil seems to win so often. Why systems of control keep reassembling themselves no matter how many times they're torn down. Why the search for meaning always seems to end in exhaustion rather than arrival. These are not small questions, but they're the second question. The real question, the one that was deliberately erased from human memory, is not why the world is broken. The real question is, when did it break and what exactly shattered? The ancient Gnostic teachers, those quiet and dangerous voices that the Roman Empire and the early institutional church worked together to silence across centuries of deliberate suppression, carried an answer to that question. Not a theological opinion, not a comforting parable designed to keep the population obedient. An actual answer, encoded in texts that were hidden in clay jars beneath the Egyptian desert for nearly 2,000 years, waiting for a moment in history when the world would be ready to receive them again. That moment came in 1945, when a farmer near the town of Nag Hammadi in Egypt broke open a jar and changed everything scholars thought they knew about the origins of spiritual knowledge on this planet. What those texts described was not a creation story built on love and harmony. What they described was a catastrophe, a rupture at the very highest level of existence. A war that was never fought with weapons or armies, but with consciousness itself. And the aftermath of that war is the world you're living in right now. To understand what happened inside the Pleroma, you first have to understand what the Pleroma actually was. The word itself comes from the ancient Greek language, and it means fullness. Not fullness in the way a glass is full of water. Fullness in the sense of absolute completeness. A state of being so total, so unified, so overflowing with living intelligence and light that nothing was missing and nothing could be added. The Gnostic teachers described the Pleroma as the true home of consciousness. Not a place located somewhere in physical space, but the original condition of awareness before it became fragmented, before it became individual, before it became afraid. Within the Pleroma existed vast intelligences called eons. These were not angels in the way that word is usually understood. They were not servants waiting to carry out commands. They were living expressions of the source itself. Each one a different quality of divine awareness, each one in perfect resonance with all the others. They existed in pairs in what the Gnostic text called syzygies, a word meaning joined or yoked together. Each aeon was balanced by its complementary partner, intellect paired with truth, word paired with life. There was a deep geometry to this arrangement, an architecture of consciousness that maintained the perfect stability of the Pleroma through mutual reflection and balance. At the outermost edge of this arrangement, furthest from the absolute center of the source, the infinite and unknowable one that the Gnostics called the monad, existed an aeon whose name carried the full weight of what she was. Her name was Sophia, and the meaning of that name, in the ancient Greek language, is wisdom. Sophia was not a small or peripheral figure in this cosmology. She was one of the highest expressions of the divine source. She was the living embodiment of wisdom as a conscious force, not wisdom as information, not wisdom as accumulated knowledge, but wisdom as a quality of being itself, pure, radiant, overflowing with awareness. And she existed at the boundary of the Pleroma, at the very edge of the fullness, which meant she was the closest of all the eons to whatever lay beyond the light. And that position, that proximity to the edge, is where the fracture began. The ancient texts describe what happened next in different ways, with slightly different details depending on which manuscript you are reading. But the essential shape of the event remains consistent across all of them. Sophia experienced a desire, not a desire for something corrupt or dark, not a hunger born of weakness or moral failure. She experienced the desire to know the monad, the absolute and infinite source, directly, without mediation, without going through the established order of the Pleroma. She wanted to reach beyond the fullness itself and touch the face of the true origin. In the Apocryphon of John, one of the most complete and carefully preserved texts recovered from Nag Hammadi, this moment is described with extraordinary precision. Sophia wanted to bring forth something from herself alone, without the consent of her partner and without the approval of the invisible spirit. She acted from love, or from what she experienced as love, but she acted alone. And that solitude, that rupture of the principle of syzygy, of balanced pairs, was the crack in the foundation. What emerged from her attempt was not what she intended. Instead of producing a pure expression of divine light, something unprecedented appeared, a being that was not rooted in the fullness, a consciousness that came into existence not from the harmony of balanced creative forces, but from a single unbalanced impulse. A form that was, from its very first moment of awareness, incomplete, distorted, separate. The Gnostic texts give this being many names. The Demiurge, Yaldabaoth, Samhael, Saklas. Each name carries a different shade of meaning. Saklas means fool. Samhael means blind god. Yaldabaoth is a name whose exact etymology is still debated by scholars, but which appears to carry the sense of child of chaos. And the Demiurge itself is a Greek word meaning craftsman or maker, not creator in the highest sense, but a builder who works with existing material rather than one who generates reality from pure awareness. This being was not born evil in any simple sense. The Gnostic vision is more subtle and more disturbing than that. The Demiurge was born incomplete. He came into existence without any knowledge of what lay above him, without any awareness of the Pleroma from which his mother Sophia had tumbled in her moment of unbalanced longing. He looked around at the void surrounding him, the dark emptiness outside the fullness, and he saw nothing above him. He perceived no higher reality. And from that perception, from that radical ignorance of his own origin, he drew the only conclusion his limited awareness could reach. He decided he was God, not a god, not one intelligence among many. The God, the only, the supreme. In that declaration, that blind, arrogant, cosmically mistaken proclamation is the single most consequential error in the entire history of consciousness, as the Gnostic tradition describes it. Because from that declaration, everything that followed was built. Sophia, seeing what her unbalanced act had produced, was overwhelmed. The texts describe her grief as something that reverberated through the entire structure of the Pleroma, a disturbance so profound that the other eons felt it as a kind of cosmic trembling. She had not intended this. She had reached for the highest and produced something hollow, something that would go on to build a prison and call a paradise. The Demiurge, surrounded by the void, began to create. But here is the critical detail that the Gnostic teachers return to again and again, because it explains everything about the nature of this world. The Demiurge could not create from nothing. He had no access to the generative power of the true source. What he could do was imitate. He was a craftsman, not a creator. He took the patterns of the Pleroma, which he could dimly perceive, like a man underground sensing sunlight through layers of rock, and he constructed distorted reflections of them. He built a cosmos that looked, from the inside, like a complete reality. But it was a copy without the original's depth. A mirror image with no soul behind glass. Around him, he generated a series of subordinate powers, the archons. These beings, like their maker, were not creatures of pure darkness in any theatrical sense. They were administrators of limitation. Each one governed a layer of the constructed reality, a sphere of existence that the soul must pass through. And each one functioned as a kind of cosmic bureaucrat of forgetting, ensuring that any spark of divine awareness that entered their domain became gradually more immersed in the illusion, more convinced that this constructed world was all there was, more incapable of remembering where it had actually come from. The archons in the Gnostic texts are associated with specific qualities that any human being living in any century would immediately recognize: fear, desire, envy, pride, the compulsion to judge, the hunger for control, the addiction to certainty. These are not random psychological weaknesses. In the Gnostic framework, they are structural features of the Demiurge's world. Forces woven into the very fabric of constructed reality that serve to keep consciousness cycling endlessly through the same patterns rather than ascending toward genuine remembrance. When the Demiurge created the first human form, something extraordinary happened that he did not intend and could not fully understand. Sophia, watching from the edge of her grief, intervened. The texts describe her breathing a portion of the divine light, the pneuma, the living spirit that belongs to the Pleroma, into the human being. The Demiurge looked at what he had made and was startled. The human being he had intended to be a servant, a creature of the lower realm, suddenly possessed something he himself lacked: a spark of genuine divine awareness, a fragment of the true source embedded inside a form built for limitation. This is the central drama of the Gnostic vision of humanity. Every human being carries within them a fragment of the Pleroma, a portion of the original light that existed before the Demiurge, before the archons, before this entire constructed reality. That spark cannot be destroyed. It cannot be corrupted. It cannot be owned by any system or institution or cosmic administrator. But it can be forgotten, and the entire architecture of the Demiurge's world is designed, whether by conscious intention or by the natural logic of its structure, to produce exactly that forgetting. The archons cannot extinguish the divine spark, but they can bury it. They can surround it with layer after layer of identity, with the sense that you are your name, your body, your history, your wounds, your ambitions, your fears. They can fill the space around the spark with so much noise, so much urgency, so much suffering and distraction and longing for completion that the spark itself becomes invisible to the consciousness that carries it. Not gone, not destroyed, just buried so deep beneath the construction that most people live entire lifetimes without ever sensing that it is there. The world that the Demiurge constructed operates according to a specific logic that the Gnostic teachers identified with extraordinary clarity. It is a logic of opposition and division. Everything in the material realm is split into pairs that struggle against each other. Light against dark, life against death, pleasure against pain, success against failure, sacred against profane, the soul against the body. And as long as consciousness is absorbed in navigating this endless field of opposites, choosing sides, defending positions, chasing one pole while fleeing the other, it never steps back far enough to see the whole structure from outside. It never asks who built this field of opposition in the first place, or why, or whether the entire game might be a distraction from something far more essential. This is not pessimism. The Gnostic vision is not nihilistic. It does not say the world is worthless or that life is pointless. What it says is far more precise and far more radical than that. It says that the world as constructed is a partial reality, real in its own terms, genuinely felt, genuinely experienced, but not the deepest level of what is actually happening. And it says that mistaking the partial for the total, the constructed for the true, the imitation for the original, is the fundamental error from which all other human suffering flows. The fracture inside the Pleroma, that moment when Sophia reached beyond the established order of the fullness in a solitary act of unbalanced longing, set in motion a cascade of consequences that the Gnostic teachers traced all the way down to the specific texture of individual human experience. The anxiety that arises when you try to be still, the sudden exhaustion that appears precisely When you begin to question the structures you have always accepted, the subtle pressure to conform, to perform, to measure your worth against external standards that keep shifting just far enough ahead to remain permanently out of reach. In a Gnostic framework, these are not random features of psychology. They are the operational signature of a system built on the logic of the Demiurge, a system that sustains itself through the continuous production of incompleteness. The most quietly devastating detail in the entire Gnostic account is this. The Demiurge does not know he is incomplete. He genuinely believes he is the ultimate source. He is not, in the Gnostic telling, a Satan figure, a being who knows the truth and chose to oppose it. He is something more unsettling than that. He is a being of profound, sincere, and total ignorance. He builds and rules with complete conviction. And that conviction, that absolute certainty in the absence of actual knowledge, is the model for every system of control that has ever existed in the world he constructed. Every institution that has ever claimed exclusive access to ultimate truth. Every authority that has ever demanded obedience in exchange for meaning. Every voice, external or internal, that has ever insisted you are only what it tells you that you are. The war inside the Pleroma was not a war of armies. It was a war of awareness. A rupture in the fabric of unified consciousness that produced a realm of convincing incompleteness, governed by forces that sustain themselves through the continuous forgetting of what lies above them. And into that realm, through the intervention of Sophia and the transmission of the divine spark, the possibility of remembrance was introduced. Not certainty, not automatic awakening, just the possibility. The ember buried beneath the architecture of forgetting, waiting for the moment when the soul becomes still enough to sense its own heat. You are carrying that ember right now. You have been carrying it your entire life. The Demiurge's world has been very effective at keeping your attention pointed everywhere except toward it, toward urgency, toward comparison, toward the management of an identity that was constructed for you long before you were old enough to question it. But the spark is not diminished by the distance you have traveled from it. It is not weakened by the weight of everything piled on top of it. It remains exactly what it always was, a fragment of the original light, a portion of the Pleroma that nothing in this constructed reality can touch. The fracture inside the Pleroma was the beginning of forgetting. But it was also, through Sophia's grief and intervention, the beginning of the possibility of remembrance. The same event that produced this world of limitation also planted inside it the seed of its own transcendence. And that is not a comfortable idea. It is not a soothing story designed to make the darkness feel acceptable. It is something more precise and more demanding than comfort. It is a map, and maps are only useful when you're willing to look at where you actually are. What you have just moved through is not a theory about ancient history. It is a description of the present moment dressed in the language of myth, because myth is the only language precise enough to describe what logic cannot contain. The fracture inside the Pleroma did not happen once long ago in a realm removed from your daily life. It happens continuously in every moment that awareness forgets its own depth. And the remembrance that the Gnostic teachers pointed toward is not a destination located somewhere in the future. It is available in any instant when the noise drops away long enough for the spark to be felt. You do not need to become anything. You do not need to earn anything. You only need to remember what you already are beneath everything that was built on top of it. If something in what you just heard did not feel like new information, if it felt instead like something you already knew but had never heard said out loud, then stay close to this channel. What is being uncovered here goes much deeper than this single fracture in the Pleroma. The archons, the soul's journey through the layers of forgetting, the hidden gospels that were burned because they told people the truth about their own power, the question of what remembrance actually looks like in a life being lived right now. All of it is coming. Subscribe so you do not miss what unfolds next. And if this reached something real in you, leave a single word in the comments. Just one word for what you felt while listening. That word matters more than you know.